it's almost like teaching poetry. You know, it's hard because when you teach poetry, I mean, there are certain things you can teach, right? You can teach iambic pentameter and you can teach certain ways people write poems, but reading a poem is a very individual experience. We all get a different meaning in a sense from a poem, and that's part of what makes a poem powerful, is that it allows itself, it speaks directly to us as individuals. And I think that's partly what Heschel's writing does, is it's poetic in that it strikes us in different ways. And so it's a very individual experience of reading Heschel. So it makes it a little harder to teach this sort of meaning. I didn't realize that when I was putting together the class. I began to realize it more as I was preparing to teach it. And so forgive me if I jump around a little bit, because it's not as coherent he's not as coherent a thinker as most others are, which is actually part of what makes him wonderful and unique and different. He's in a sense was ahead of his time. I'm reading a book right now, really interesting book, called Digital Judaism. And it's by this rabbi in Pittsburgh. And he essentially is talking about why movements no longer make sense. Like, I mean, we know that the past 20 years has seen the decline in organized movements and in organized religion, not just in Judaism, just organized religion generally. And he essentially is saying that the beginning in 1990, we entered into a period of hyper modernization, and that the traditional institutions that sort of framed our sense of self are not adapted to this new world in which the knowledge, the pace of change and the magnitude of the change itself is faster and greater than any other time in human history. I mean, it's remarkable. People say every 2 days, more information is uploaded to Google than was in the entire library or uploaded to YouTube than was in the entire Library of Congress in the year 2000. I mean, it's astounding how rapid the amount of change is. And now, why I bring that up in this book, he's talking about how that relates to organized Jewish movements. But I think with Heschel, for him, the rapidity of the change over his lifetime, growing up in a shtetl in Poland before World War I, and then dying in America in the early 1970s, his life, in a sense, had that rapidity of change because of his unique circumstances. And so his writing and his theology reflect that vast experience. I mean, all of us in this group have probably experienced a lot of change in life, but I would venture to say none of us have experienced the amount of change that Heschel did. You know, growing up in a tiny shtetl and probably not speaking any English and probably barely speaking anything but Yiddish, and then losing your whole family in the Holocaust, and then coming to the United States, living in Cincinnati, and then living in New York. And I mean, just the array of experiences in his life are very much reflected in his writing, and it adds to the depth of it. And it also, again, he's not a very organized, logical. He wouldn't have made a good lawyer, let's say. A lawyer, you present your arguments, you're rational, you have to prove it. He's more evocative. He's more poetry than prose. So that's why it's a little trickier to kind of capture his ideas. But nevertheless, we will attempt to do so, and we will enjoy doing so because they are wonderful ideas. Now, I want to start off by giving a little bit of context, historical context, as to the environment in which Heschel was writing and why this made him uniquely appealing. So, American Judaism in the 1930s went through a severe decline. So the affiliation rate and the number of people who affiliated with synagogues and attended synagogues declined significantly in the 1930s. It had gone up in the 1920s, but the 1930s, obviously you have the Depression, which is a tremendous financial burden on synagogues. I mean, you look at, it was, people couldn't afford to join it, and you know, they couldn't afford to pay staff and so forth. So you have that, and then you have a real rise in anti-Semitism. So people were not eager to identify as Jews. That was a period of very significant assimilation. People were very much, not everybody, of course, and not everybody was uncomfortable. You know, I found a member of my family sent me a picture of my grandma on my mom's side, who, her father was a very successful guy, entrepreneur, you know, owned buildings in Milwaukee and things. They were a successful family. Now, he lost a whole bunch of it during the Depression, but later in the Depression. So this relative sent me a picture of them from Thanksgiving in 1929. So this was after the stock market crash, and they all looked fine. They were enjoying life. It looked like it could have been just any normal time. Now, of course, things got worse. But so the Depression didn't hurt everybody, but it had a tremendous impact on synagogues. So Jewish affiliation was declining, synagogue attendance was declining, things were not good. Then, post-World War II, you have this tremendous boom in Jewish life. And in fact, anti-Semitism also declined significantly. Of course, it was not eliminated by any means, but the number of people who had very negative feelings about Jews declined a lot between 1945 and 1948. Probably in some ways, maybe the Holocaust, is the devastation. So really, from about 1945 to late 1960s, you have a boom in synagogue life and synagogue building. I mean, look, Macomb and or Solel and Lakeside were both founded during that period of time. So this is a serious period. Now, what was the type of Judaism that was practiced in these congregations, which were mostly non-Orthodox? Well, it was a kind of church-like Judaism. Now, we think of classical Reform Judaism, and you think of organs and choirs, and that essentially is pretty close to what the Judaism that was practiced in even conservative synagogues. Conservative synagogues would have a little bit more Hebrew. They would have a rabbi who would have a yarmulke, but in general, it was pretty formal. It was decorum. It was in many ways a kind of, I'm not using this in a negative way, but it was assimilationist in that it was modeled more on sort of church prayer and practice with a Jewish content. No, there weren't prayers to Jesus, but it was the form of it was more formal and more rooted in sort of a Protestant nature. Now, this wasn't true in Orthodox synagogues, of course, although there were some Orthodox synagogues in which this was more the case. Now, Heschel is writing in this context, and he is essentially saying this type of Judaism is boring, irrelevant, and doesn't speak to our spiritual yearnings. So he is critiquing the kind of Judaism that was predominant in the 1950s and 1960s. And that is very much the case in which we need to see the nature of his critique. Now, one way of understanding his critique is, has anyone here heard of what was called the Lakeville studies? which was a sociological study of the North Shore of Chicago. It was anonymous. They called it Lake City and Lakeville, but it was really about Highland Park, done in the 1950s and 1960s. Alan, you have. And Alan, tell me, what was the Lakeville studies about? Alan, we lost your video. Okay. I'll fill in until Alan comes. So Lakeville was Highland Park. Lake City was Chicago. And this book is a beautiful, Marshall Sklar was the first Jewish sociologist, and he studied Lakeville to understand what Judaism meant to the people who lived in Lakeville at the time. And he did cross denominations, and he did individual synagogues. It's a fascinating study. And what he found was essentially being Jewish for that group meant being a good person and being civically minded. And it really had very little to do with prayer or mitzvot. It didn't speak the language of spirituality. It spoke the language of integrating into the wider culture. And it reflected more ethnicity than spirituality. By the way, it's very, very interesting sociological study. He actually studied Solel, Lakeside, and B'nai Torah as the three Reformed, and North Shore Congregation Israel, although that was in Glencoe, but he sort of, so what he found was the communities from Solel and Lakeside did not generally socialize with the community at B'nai Torah. Why? Because most of the families at Lakeside and Solel, the two, were from Hyde Park or the North Side. B'nai Torah were Jews from the West Side. And in Chicago at the time, there was still a distinction. Generally, the West Side were more recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, whereas Hyde Park and parts of the North Side, not every, Hyde Park much more, but were generally older communities of German Jews. And they each had their kind of outpost in Highland Park. It's fascinating. Of course, that's not true today at all anymore. I mean, but it still was much more ethnic and cultural than religious. And that's the context in which Heschell is writing. And Heschell offers a total alternative to that way of life. He said that Judaism, he was trying to bring the spirituality of the Hasidic movement to 1950s America. And he believed the biggest sin for Judaism was to be boring or irrelevant and not to make your heart move. So he wasn't interested in proving how Jews can be good Americans or Jews could be good citizens. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in how can Judaism speak to the heart of people right now, right here. So I want to, questions about this. Okay. I want to go to page 35 in our reader. I can put it up on the screen too. Oh, let's see here. Let me share screen also. Where's my Zoom? Okay, share screen. Oh, Stacy, can you make me a co-host? Here we go. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay. So here, this is what he is trying to do. I'm going to read this. Faith is not a clinging to a shrine, but an endless pilgrimage of the heart. But that clinging to a shrine, that reminds me, initially, there was no building where Congregation Solel. I'm not sure about the history of Lakeside in this regard, but Arnold Jacob Wolf, or no, it was actually Jacob Weinstein said, synagogue can easily get an edifice complex where they're attached to the building instead of the community. So he's saying faith is not a clinging to a shrine, but an endless pilgrimage of the heart. audacious longings, burning songs, daring thoughts, an impulse overwhelming the heart, usurping the mind. These are all a drive towards serving him who rings our hearts like a bell. It is as if he were waiting to enter our empty, perishing lives. So this is what he is trying to address, is what he sees as missing is this deep sense of spirituality, a sense of wonder, a sense of awe. Any reactions to this? Any, it's beautiful, isn't it? Any other thoughts? You know, he's sort of a countercultural voice. It's a countercultural. He's trying to awaken a kind of emotion and romanticism in a very kind of rational, technocratic era. Yeah, Marilyn, go ahead.
Yes, I've heard him speak and say that to him, prayer, if I can, I'll just be paraphrasing what I remember. Prayer is a song, it's a chant.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't live without song.
Yeah.
So when we pray, I've also heard another rabbi say that to pray is another way of singing.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Prayer is another way of singing.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk even more about prayer, but you're absolutely right. This is what he is trying to seek. You know, I don't know if I mentioned this last week. I talked about it somewhere. I can't remember, but no, I didn't, because I gave a lecture at another recently, and I talked about this, so it wasn't in our class. Most of the early, probably 90% of the founders of Buddhism in America, sort of the people that studied in India or Thailand and brought sort of a Buddhism to America, they were almost all Jewish. And you ask yourself, why? Why is that? And they some still are. You ask why? Well, it's because of what we're talking about here, that the kind of Judaism that existed really in the 50s and 60s did not speak to the heart. It spoke to the mind. I mean, we're always been intellectual. You know, Jews are generally intellectual. That's how we are. But it didn't speak to the heart as much. Heschel wanted it to speak to the heart. And I think that's what sort of the early Buddhists wanted, something that was more emotional and kind of effect was embodied, and you could feel a kind of passion and a connection to it. And that's what Heschel is looking for. And the other thing that Heschel, though, Judaism has to be embodied. It's not just the mind and the spirit, it's also action. And he wrote, in 1942, his first major essay in America was called The Pious Man. And I have an excerpt from it. It's on page, where's this? 39 here. So I'll just read this. The pious man is possessed by his awareness of the presence and nearness of God. Everywhere and at all times, he lives as in his sight, whether he remains always heedful of his proximity or not. He feels embraced by God's mercy as by a vast encircling space. Awareness of God is as close to him as the throbbing of his own heart, often deep and calm, but at times overwhelming, intoxicating, setting the soul afire. The momentous reality of God stands there as peace, power, and endless tranquility, as an inexhaustible source of help, as boundless compassion, and as an open gate awaiting prayer. It sometimes happens that the life of a pious man becomes so involved in God that his heart overflows as though it were a cup in the hand of God. Isn't that beautiful? Now, interestingly, Mordecai Kaplan read this essay, and Mordecai Kaplan then wrote a poem based on the essay. And I have it for you. I'm going to open it up right here. Let's see. Let me get my my screen share. Okay, I'm gonna share this now. Okay, where is this? Hold on a minute here. Let me see here.
Evan,
Yes, go ahead.
while you're looking for that, I have to believe, as a member of the congregation in the early 60s on, that Arnold Jacob Wolf subscribed to that feeling
Very
and
much
was
so.
part of that dogma of feeling, of doing, and thinking of God, as Heschel has said in the first thing that you read. I think that paraphrases a lot of what Arnold did for the congregation.
Very much so. Very, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things that made Arnold unique and the congregation different. At least, at least in aspiration, if not always in reality, nobody's perfect. But at least in aspiration was a desire to make Judaism feel more relevant and engaging. I can't figure out how to post this, but I'll read it in a second. Unless I got it now. You're absolutely right. Arnold, here it is. Arnold wanted that feeling. Okay, Sue, go ahead. Okay.
You've got the poem up now, so do that, and then I'll.
Okay. So this is a poem that Mordecai Kaplan wrote based on Heschel's essay. The Pious Man. What is piety? Is it abandonment of the world? Is it scrupulous performance of rites or fanatic zeal? Let us observe the pious man and probe into his soul. We shall discover in it that which transcends man, that which surmounts the visible and available, steadily preventing him from immersing himself in sensation or ambition, from yielding to passion or slaving for a career. For him, life takes place amid horizons beyond the span of years. He senses the significant in small things. He is alive to the sublime in common acts and simple thoughts. He feels the warmth of good beneath the thick crust of evil. In the rush of passing, he notes the stillness of the eternal. That's a Heschel line. He complies with destiny. He is at peace with life. Every experience opens to him the door into a temple of light, though the vestibule be dark and dismal. His responsibility to God is the scaffold on which he stands as daily he builds his life. He serves his family, friends, community, and nation. Engrossed in the beauty of what he worships, he shuns self-display. The wise man, master of himself, oft deems himself author of his mastery. Not so the pious, who, no less master of himself, administers his life in God's name. The wise man seeks to penetrate into the soul of the sacred. The pious man ever strives to be penetrated by it. Faith engages a man's mind, piety his entire life. Faith precedes piety. Piety is faith's achievement. Faith desires to meet God, piety to abide by him. Faith strives to know his will, piety to do it. Faith yearns to hear his voice, piety to respond to it. The pious man is never alone, for God is within reach of his heart. In affliction, though desolate for a moment, he need but turn his eyes to discover his grief outflanked by God's compassion. Having achieved understanding, he believes. Having acquired, he gives away. Having lived, he knows how to die. He craves not vainly for the endless rotation of his own life's wheel. He is content to merge his being into that of the God he loves. How beautiful is that? I mean, it's just this. What Kaplan did is he kind of took this spiritual poem and idea of Heschel, and he kind of, he made it more logical and rational. He kind of contrasted. I mean, this is really this really is the two parts of every human being. We have this is like left brain and right brain in some ways. You know, the left brain is the analytical, orderly, rational brain. And the right brain is the artistic, looking at things as a whole, kind of feeling brain. And of course, they're connected. You know, they rely on each other, but they have different interests. And Heschel, his critique is that America, especially American Jews, we're really too much in the left brain. So we should bring a sense of the right brain. We can't master everything. Sometimes we need to surrender and feel the piety and the sense of belonging in God. It's a very moving idea, and you know, maybe necessary today just as much as it was then. Any other reactions to this? Any feelings about this prayer? Yeah, Sue.
Well, not only this prayer, but everything we've read today prior to this speaks to me of conscience.
Yes.
And that when we say that God needs man, that's our conscience. And we know right from wrong. And
Yes.
it's up to us to do what is right. And then we're doing God's will.
Yes. Very well said. Very well said. And I think what Heschel is sort of identifying is we know, as you said, we know, and yet so often we don't do. It's kind of, you know, we have a rational answer, but for some irrational reason or whatever, we ignore it or we don't pursue it. And Heschel's trying to say, well, what's the spark that leads you to do it, to really let your feelings go, you know, to kind of embrace that experience. Listen, in a sense, how can you listen to your conscience? How can we get out of our own way and listen to it? And that's
Can I call you back in about 30 minutes?
Jeff?
Okay, bye.
Oh,
It's Joan.
okay. Are we muted?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, it's Joan Lust.
John, go ahead.
We're both here.
We're both here.
Good.
What struck me about it is that it seems, especially there are two lines, but very interactive, that it's not just God or just man, but there's this continual interaction between the two of them.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of the I Thou of Martin Buber.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they were interesting. Heschel and Buber, they were not friends, they were respectful colleagues. And Heschel basically, you're exactly right. So Heschel grew up Hasidic. So he knew the stories of the Hasids really, really well. Buber discovered the Hasids later, and Buber took from the Hasids this idea of I thou. And when someone once asked Heschel, what do you think about Buber's idea of I thou? He's like, I knew about that before Buber said it. It was in the Hasids. So they I guess maybe they had a little bit of a friendly competition, but it's the exact same idea, that there is a deeper sense of relationship. And you know, the truth is, we need I, thou, and I, it. You know, if you're going into an Uber, you may not want to have an I, thou relationship with your Uber driver. You may not want to hear his life story or know everything about his family. And so you may just want to get a ride to the airport or wherever you're going. And that's fine. But if all of life is I, it, and you don't have any intimacy or deep friendship, you know, then you don't have any I, thou, then life becomes irrelevant and meaningless. We need the I, thou. And I think what Heschel was saying is that in the synagogue has become too much of an I, it. It's too formal, and we treat our relationship with God as it. God, I want a new car. Okay, say the prayer and you get. That's not how it works. Heschel is kind of saying you need to open yourselves, hear the music, sing, feel. That is the path to I thou. Just like in a good friendship. I mean, with your closest friends, your spouse, or a closest friend, you can truly be vulnerable and be open and share pain. And that's an I thou. And you're not trying to impress anybody, Sure, sometimes out in the world you need to impress people. You need to dress nice. You need to, that's normal. You need to do that sometimes, but that's not everything. And so Heschel is trying to bring that sensibility to the synagogue. Very much. Any other questions about this particular poem?
Rabbi,
Yeah, Marilyn, go ahead.
Todd Rosenberg.
Todd, go ahead, then Marilyn.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's hard for sitting in here, but obviously this is coming from a guy who was the chief sociologist of Judaism, and he must have been heavily influenced by Buber to create this kind of poetry, because that was totally contrary to everything that Kaplan really talked about, and how Kaplan had to split off and create the Reconstructionist movement because of that.
Yes.
I don't remember what year he did that, but obviously he was a religious sociologist.
Yes.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was on a business trip and I picked up Man Is Not Alone, which is one of Heschel's books.
One of his first. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is really expands upon this whole poetry concept in spades. And it's hard for me as a lawyer to follow. You're right, but
So.
yeah, it's heavily into poetry.
Yeah, very much so. Yes, it's hard to read. It's poetry and prose are two very different forms of literature, and we live in a mostly prose world. If you want to think about it that way, our world is mostly prose, and generally that's good because you need rules, you need certain norms and practices, and we have to law has to organize a very large, diverse, difficult society. So you need prose and logic. But in the sphere of human intimacy and relationships, we need poetry. We need that. And I think that's sort of what Heschel, Kaplan, and maybe we'll do a class on Kaplan because I love reading Kaplan. His writing isn't as, poetic, so to speak, as Heschel's, but Kaplan is interested in sort of creating a new structure for the Jewish people. Whereas Heschel is just interested in speaking to the Jewish soul. Heschel is not interested in organizing a movement or creating new schools. Those are, he preferred to leave that to, the institutionalists. He's much more interested in speaking right to the heart. That's his focus. Marilyn, and then Jeff and Joan. Marilyn, go ahead, unmute.
I love the line where he says, the responsibility to God is the scaffold on which he stands as daily he builds his life.
Yeah.
And I love as he can, and then there's that space, like going up the scaffold, he leaves a space, because usually a scaffold, there's levels, the wood, is layered, and he leaves that space in his form. And then he says he serves the family, the friend, the community, and the nation. And it's interesting because the title is The Pious, I can't see it because it's The Pious Man.
Pious Man.
And yet when he says, what is piety? He goes on, and I can't see those words, but he talks about faith over and over and over again. And you can't have piety unless you have faith. But you can't have faith unless you study Torah, unless you are affiliated with a community and all the things that he listed, care about friends and nation. And you can't just wake up one day and say, I have faith. You have to live
Yeah.
your life.
Well, he kind of contrasts faith and piety. You're right. He's using them with his own definitions. He's saying that faith is like knowledge, whereas piety is faith in some ways. So one way to think about it
Could you
is,
show that part? Could you?
yeah, here,
because I couldn't really
here,
go over it
faith
again.
precedes piety. Piety is faith's achievement. Faith desires to meet God, piety to abide by him. Faith strives to know his will, piety to do it. Faith yearns to hear his voice, piety to respond to it. I would say in some ways, one way that this analogy just came to mind. Faith is the university, piety is the synagogue. You know, if you were to take a Jewish studies class at a university, they would teach it differently than how I teach it. You know, I could teach at a university, and I'm sure probably one of the university professors could teach at a synagogue. You know, you play different roles, but they represent something. It's almost like the difference maybe between a lecture and a sermon. You know, a lecture, I'm going to inform you about different things. I'm not going to try to speak to your heart. I'm just going to give you knowledge. Now, maybe a really good lecture, or maybe you also speak to the heart, but in general, a lecture is conveying information. A sermon at its best tries to speak to the heart, to evoke a response. Yeah, if people cry during a sermon, I'm like, yes. You know, not always, but if it moves, no, it's like a sign. If it moves the heart, if it gets people to feel, to me, that's a success. You know, and that's not the case in a university lecture. So I think he might say faith is a lecture, whereas piety is a sermon, is a speaking. It's going right to the heart. You know, we need both. You know, it's not, I'm not saying one is superior to the other. They each have their place.
But I don't think you can lead to piety if you just talk about faith and you don't participate in actions that like I say, this class, Torah study, maybe listening to a sermon, a service, you have to have participation.
Yes.
You can't just get up every day and have a mundane life and say, oh, I have faith. You know, well, yes, maybe you do, but it's not as pious as a man who practices faith in an active way. You become, as you do that, piety and faith, you achieve it. Because it's like lifting weights. It's like you can't go to the gym
and just observe.
Pick up a 50-pound weight.
Yeah. Another analogy that comes to mind is the difference between a museum and a synagogue or church. Like, you know, if you go into a museum, let's say you're visiting a cathedral in Europe. Let's say you're in Europe, you go visit Notre Dame, you go, beautiful. You're going to love it. It's very moving and powerful. Great. But you're there as an observer. Whereas if you go into a synagogue, you're there as a participant. Now, you may be observing too, maybe a very beautiful synagogue and, you know, nice stained glass windows, you know, good music, but you're also participating. And that's the difference. Yeah, Jeff and Joan.
Yeah, I was also, you know, looking at this, and it's in a poetic structure. To read poetry requires you to slow down. When you try to read it fast, you lose most of it. No matter who you are, whether you read poetry all the time or you're new to it. And it also has its own rhythm, which in itself creates a feeling in your mind and your body, really, just like it's music. It's rhythmic. So I think it's interesting that he chose to write this as a poem rather than just commenting in a normal intellectual prose, because it's much harder to achieve the same thing in prose. And in poetry, you're even choosing carefully the words with a number of syllables to maintain that rhythm. So it gives, I think, a much more spiritual impact when it moves you.
Yes, yes. And you know, it's interesting. One of the tools of biblical scholarship if you look at the Hebrew Bible, the oldest parts are the poetry. The Song of the Sea, the song, that's one of the very oldest parts of the whole Torah. That's written before a lot else. There are parts of the Psalms that are older than parts of the book of Genesis. The Song of Deborah, which is in one of the prophetic books, that is one of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible. So the poetry is older than the prose. Now, why is that important? It's because that speaks to that was there when human beings weren't writing anything down. That was when we were transmitting things orally. That was the poetry. So it has a rhythm to it. That may just be it. That's easier to memorize. When these texts were passed on, people had to memorize it. So it was some person's job to memorize. And so the song and the rhythm makes it easier. Other comments? Okay. Let's move on a little bit. Oh, we're doing great here. I'm loving this discussion. Okay. I'm gonna turn off this share because we're okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about prayer now. We kind of started talking about prayer. Now, and then we're going to look at a couple of Heschel quotes about prayer. But just to think about it, the role of prayer in Judaism is different than the role of prayer in Christianity in a lot of ways. Like, for example, I spoke at a church recently, the one in Northbrook. You've probably driven by it. It's that village church. They asked me to come speak at one of their programs about Judaism. And I asked the pastor, I said, how big's the church? And he said, well, we get 150 people on a Sunday morning. He didn't tell me the membership size. And someone said, how big is the congregation? I said, 600 families, 500, however. He told me the number of people that come to worship. And that is generally, that is how churches measure their strength, is the people who come on a Sunday morning. That's not how synagogues measure their strength. We have a lot of people who are committed, but don't come regularly. Now, we happen to have a great regular crowd, which is wonderful, but that's not the norm. And also it's not, it doesn't reflect the strength of a community. So then one could make the conclusion then that prayer in Judaism is less important part of the structure than it is in Christianity. And that may be true to a degree. However, Heschel wanted to fix that. The reason prayer may not be as important in Judaism is that traditionally, prayer was seen as purely a legal. Prayer was part of Jewish law. You have to pray 3 times a day, and you try to get through the prayers quickly, and it's not as much about the feeling of the prayer as it is just doing the prayer. And how many of you have heard of the 2 terms, keva and kavanah? Have you heard of it? Raise your hand if you have. Yeah. So, okay, good. So we got a smart group here. Keva is the fixed order of prayer. So keva is, first we say the Baruch Hu, then we say the Shema, then we say the Ve'ahavta, then we say the Amidah, then we say Oseh Shalom, then we say the Aleinu. That is keva. That is order. That is fixed. Keva, literally, when you hang a mezuzah at a home, it's likboa mezuzah, to fix the mezuzah. Likboa mezuzah. That's keva, same root. Keva is important. I like keva. If you notice, when I lead services on Friday night, I like to do the same readings over and over again. I do. It's just how I like. Not everybody likes it. Okay. I like there's a consistency that speak, there's a comfort in doing the same thing. When I go to eat at a restaurant, I get the same thing every time. Okay. I'm boring. That's just how I am. So that's keva. Kavanah is the emotion, the feeling behind it. What's the spirituality you're bringing to it? It can be kind of spontaneous. What is the emotion, the sort of sense of purpose? What are you bringing to that prayer? Not just are you mouthing the words, but are you feeling the words? And they're both important in Judaism. They're both a part of Jewish prayer. And Heschel would say the keva has become too important, wherein people are ignoring the kavanah, the feeling of intention. And that's kind of what he's writing about. What creates kavanah is a sense of awe and wonder. You know, last week we talked about, I think, Susan, you mentioned the caves in Kentucky. And I was just, this is so funny. I came across this reading. I was reading an essay, and it was talking about this feeling of awe and wonder on some caves in France, I think. Yeah, I'm going to read this. Let me share the screen here if I can find it. This just struck me. This is almost the definition of awe and wonder. So this is a writer named Paul Kingsnorth, and he wrote an essay called In the Black Chamber. It's about what he thought and felt when he and his family visited a prehistoric cave in the French Pyrenees and saw cave paintings. I'm overtaken by a number of emotions as I stand in the black chamber, but the one that proves impossible to shake off is a huge sense of awe, a physical sensation that I did not expect and don't quite know how to handle. It is as if something age-old and darkly powerful has descended from the roof of the cavern and settled in me and will not leave. And as I look at the paintings and take in the sensations of being in this place, I think that perhaps I begin to understand why people were here. I don't know what they did or who they were, but I can feel the power in the place, and it tells me why they might have come here. It seems obvious to me, but I think the scant evidence bears it out that whatever happened in the black chamber was not driven by utility. Whoever was here and whatever they were doing, they were forging a connection to something way beyond everyday reality. These paintings are not expressions of economics or natural history. They surely sprung from the same sense of power and smallness and wonder and awe that I feel as I stand in the same place that the artist would have stood. This was a reaching out to for something way beyond human comprehension. This was a meeting with the sacred. Isn't that beautiful? So I think why this struck out, why this spoke to me is I think this is the kind of feeling that Heschel wants us to get in prayer. That sense of awe and connection. And it doesn't have to be in these caves. Some people would feel that at the Western Wall. Some people would feel that at Masada. Some people would feel that maybe at the Dead Sea or other places. Some people would feel it at a mountaintop. But that deep encounter with something we can't understand, but that we feel points to something larger. I know this is a kind of a big question, but has anyone had that experience? And where was it? Anyone had that experience? Or let me make this a little more specific, because we probably have all had some sort of experience like that. When has anyone had that in a synagogue? And what was the context? When did that happen? Maybe it was a grandchild's bar mitzvah. Maybe it was some music. Some people really get that from music. Has anyone had that type of experience where you just feel you are absolutely certain that there is something larger out there? It's called a Heschel experience. Who's had that? Yeah, Sue and then Edwin.
Yeah. First of all, I need to talk about why I'm a Reformed Jew.
Good.
I was raised in a classical Reformed synagogue. And I mean classical, when you talked about something being churchy.
Yeah.
A little bit like that. But what I was used to was order, just as you said. And everybody was orderly and quiet and prayed, in unison, or listened to the rabbi or whoever was on the bima. And it was quiet. And then I got married and moved to Aurora, and the synagogue was conservative bordering on Orthodoxy. And it was so disjointed to me. And everybody was praying at their own speed and their own, it was just chaos to me,
Mhm,
and it left me cold.
mhm,
But I will say that when my two oldest children, who were born in England, and then when we came back to the United States and they were given their names in the synagogue,
mm,
when we came back and talking about having this feeling that my children were being truly blessed
mm.
by something larger
Yeah,
than Dick and I could give them,
beautiful.
was that sense that you're talking about.
That's great. That is great. That's a great example. That happens at life cycle events are the opening to that, where you feel, I mean, that's baby naming, bar mitzvahs, weddings, that's in a sense when we are most open to that experience. Good. Alan, go ahead.
Two things. First one is myself. And it came at the point of Kol Nidre at the beginning of the service. First listening to the cello and then listening to Jay. More than any other service, that reminded me of the long succession of people before me. And I started picturing my parents and my grandparents sitting and listening to the same melody over the years. The other thing was actually our son, Richard. When we were in Israel on a family mission and he was 13, we were outside the Western Wall, and he suddenly thought he was blind. He was so struck by the experience.
Wow.
And we had to hustle him back to the hotel. Being only 13, he wasn't able to really explain to us what more he felt, but he had such an awestruck feeling that he felt blind.
Wow. That's very powerful. Very powerful. And yeah, and I love your story about Kol Nidre. That reminds me, I wasn't there, but my grandfather used to tell this story of when he was overseas in World War II in Glasgow, Scotland during the war, and went to a synagogue for Kol Nidre, and he was the only person there in uniform, and they called him up to open the Torah and hold the Torah during Kol Nidre. And he said that was just one of those experiences, and just thinking about that gives me goosebumps. They're this young guy going up and never left Milwaukee before then, and during World War II. These moments are incredibly powerful. Yeah. Todd, go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting. The sense of awe generally comes from physical structures, as we saw by the example of caves. So churches did this traditionally. I mean, you'd walk in these churches and the ceilings would be 4 or 5 stories high. The echo was in there in these classic churches, and they're designed to create awe just from the physical structure. Obviously, a lot of modern synagogues and churches have moved totally away from that. I think the whole movement is to become more of a personal relationship-oriented structure. Make it warmer, make it make it comfortable, as opposed to that kind of intimidating structure. But I think creating the sense of awe has largely been done through physical means in a lot of churches and synagogues, because synagogues were largely patterned after churches and mosques.
Go to KAM. Go to KAM in Hyde Park. I mean, that sanctuary, that creates awe. I mean, it's unbelievable. And that was a period, even Temple Sholem, it's not the same, but there is that, you go in that sanctuary and there is a sense of awe. And you're right. The trend has been away from that to more informality. I think there needs to be a balance, right? We sometimes we crave that awe, and most of the time we probably are more happy with the informal. It's it's a difficult balance. We used to have a congregant, he's since passed away, but he always wanted me to be more formal and do more kind of responsive readings. And he was of a certain generation where that was, you know, the kind of role he saw. And I think, you know, the culture shifted, but there is sometimes still space for that.
It's very
Yeah.
interesting. People here might not be familiar with it, but in Cleveland, there's a very large temple that goes back to the 20s and 30s. To Ferrith, if you're familiar with it, Abba Hillel Silver, who spoke
Yeah.
at the United Nations, it was his temple. And if you look at the photos, it's designed after the dome that you see on the Temple Mount. It's giant, it's gold, it's huge.
Yeah.
And it's intentionally designed to mimic that large architectural structure that you can see for miles and miles, that giant gold dome that reflects the light. And again, it's that whole movement to create awe in the physical facility.
Yes, it's a good point. I would also add, in some ways, we Jews have always been a little bit more resistant to too much formality. You know, it's interesting. I'll just give an example. Back when I was at Sinai, we used to have high holy day services for the community at Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago. If you've ever been, it's an incredible church, incredible. And they have this high pulpit. And typically on Sunday morning, the minister at Fourth Pres preaches from this high pulpit. Well, one year, it wasn't me, it was the other rabbi, decided to do the sermon from that high pulpit, and it didn't go over so well. People didn't. Didn't feel connection. It didn't evoke that feeling, you know. So no one ever did it again, even though it's used consistently in the church. Maybe that's just habit. You get used to something, but there is a kind of informality in Judaism that I think is sort of almost a part of our culture. Yeah, Jeff and Joan. And then Ed, we missed you. Yeah. Oh, unmute.
The first time I walked into Makom Solel, and that was only in November for Joan and I, and we liked the service, we had gone other places, but what struck me architecturally is that the Torah wasn't directly behind the bima where you hold the Torah, it was to the left.
Yes.
And it kept suggesting to me a doorway into something. And I wondered if that was the point of the design or if that was just a personal reaction to it. And my eyes kept going to it that way on and off during the service in a very positive way. The Torah scrolls were behind there. It seemed like a doorway into something special.
It's very interesting. I know that it was deliberately not in the center.
Mm-hmm.
I don't exactly know why. It's a good Gail Goldstein, who she's not, I wish she were on here. I'll have to ask, she might know.
Mm-hmm.
I had heard, maybe Ed knows, but I had heard it doesn't seem right, but I had heard that in some ways it was almost in some ways to make the ark seem less important, but that doesn't sound right. Yeah. The ark covering is the paroquet, the curtain is very special and it's unusual. There aren't many curtains like ours. Some people don't like it. I love it. It's a very this very famous folk artist, Lenore Towney, who designed it. But it was sort of very different at its time. But it was I know that it was deliberately not put in the center. And that deliberately the wall behind it is very stark and white. That was meant to kind of be a certain kind of simplicity and peace in the sanctuary. There's no stained glass. Again, some people like stained glass. I like it in the right context. But yes, it is definitely deliberately designed in that way. Yeah, Ed.
A number of things. The ark itself had always been to the left of the bima as you're looking at it, because, well, one might theorize that the rabbis were in the center on the table and they were preaching to you, reading to you, and what have you. And you could also at the same time see them and see the ark with the beautiful curtain in front. And it was so, Gail was so involved in that not only is the curtain beautiful, but you see the Torahs through it. You can see what, if they're not open, but you know that the rabbi is reading from them. And you see a dual image of that. And then also, going back to what Todd said, I was also thinking, I have always, looking at the high white textured wall behind the bima, has always given me a sense of quiet, a sense of introspection, and listening strongly to what was being said and not being taken away by thinking of something else at the same time. And thirdly, what Alan said about the music, I was thinking about the same thing, not just because I've been in the choir for all these many years, but there is something about some beautiful music that transcends, that carries you, and the prayer that I keep thinking of besides Kol Nidre that takes me away is Lech Lecha at the same time.
Good point.
Enough for me.
Yeah, well, this is good. This is really good. The other prayer that takes people away is Misha Berach. That takes a lot of people away. Although I think now everyone has heard the melody so many times, it might not have the same oomph. Maybe we should hold it for special occasions, although everyone loves it. But Misha Berach does that to some people. Kol Nidre, of course. This is a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, so much. I think we are succeeding in not only learning about Heschel, but learning and to be Heschel, to be Heschelian. So I wish you all a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll see you next week.